Phones screamed as Ethan Cole's name flooded every feed, and neon headlines clawed across the bar TV while a chant formed online like a drumline with knives. Ethan whispered, "It's not real," but the bartender turned away. Margaret watched in the doorway of her apartment, hands tight at her sides, and said nothing while the hashtag barreled through midnight like a freight train. Damon Reed posted a thread that sounded like verdict and prayer, and Ava Stone shared it with a caption that smiled like glass. Riley Brooks called twice and said, "Answer me," but Ethan froze, counting heartbeats that felt like sirens. Pip spliced his laugh into accusation, and strangers agreed, because agreement tasted easy. The air thinned. The room shrank. Ethan opened his old messages and saw every joke weaponized. Margaret's porch light burned and did not blink. Neighbors scrolled. Friends typed goodbye with apology emojis. Ethan said, "Someone knows the truth," but the comment stream bit back, hungry as winter. The night had teeth, and the internet fed them his name. The headline grew fangs by morning, and Ethan stared at the ceiling as the drip in the bathroom counted seconds like a judge. He said, "It will pass," and the silence replied with static. Margaret made coffee and did not look at the news, but the radio clicked on by itself when a neighbor turned theirs up. Riley texted, "I'm with you," but her message sank beneath a fresh wave of strangers cheering the burn. Damon streamed a recap that felt like a victory lap. Ava posted a thread about accountability with a brand link tucked in like a blade in velvet. Ethan scrolled his own past and found souvenirs that no longer felt like his. He tried to remember a morning without fear and failed. The house smelled like rain and old paper. Margaret set a mug down, then left the room as if the floor were glass. Ethan said, "Mom," and the word landed fragile as a match and did not light. By noon, the sponsors vanished like tents after a storm, leaving dead grass and receipts. Ethan opened an email that began with empathy and ended with a clause shaped like a noose. He said, "You believed me yesterday," and the cursor blinked back like a metronome. Riley left a voice note that cracked on his name. Damon celebrated the swift justice with charts and arrows. Ava's follower count climbed, a gentle, merciless tide. Margaret folded laundry that didn't need folding, as if organizing fabric could sort a broken world. The doorbell rang with polite cruelty, and a courier handed silence in a branded envelope. Ethan signed with a pen that scraped like gravel. He said, "This is a mistake," but the letterhead was certain, and certainty felt like the heaviest thing in the room. The news cycle found fresh oxygen at 3 when a local station asked neighbors for quotes, and one said the word everyone hears in thunder. Ethan watched his street become a sentence. Riley paced a parking lot and said, "Say something," but the microphone in his head hissed with danger. Damon teased an exclusive. Ava teased a collaboration. Margaret closed the blinds and the room dimmed like a theater before the villain enters. Ethan said, "If I speak, I lose, and then, if I don't, I drown." The walls took sides. The floor leaned. The clock spelled accusations in slow, sure ticks. He drafted a post, deleted it, and wrote 3 words that shook. "I was there." Then he erased them, and felt the eraser leave a bruise. The betrayal arrived at dusk, wrapped in perfect timing, when Damon unveiled a clip from a private chat that wore Ethan's name like a costume. Ethan whispered, "That was edited," and the word edited felt like a paper shield in a hailstorm. Riley said, "I know your voice," and her faith was a candle in wind. Ava threaded context that bent like a funhouse mirror and called it clarity. Margaret stared at the TV and let the silence choose her. Neighbors gathered in comments and passed judgment like a plate. Ethan felt the room tilt, as if the house were a ship turning toward a black shore. He said, "Someone did this," and the night swallowed the claim, heavy with certainty not earned. The storm was no longer outside. It had learned the layout of his home. The noise of the world softened for a moment as Ethan remembered mornings before the storm, when sunlight fell across posters on his bedroom wall like quiet applause. He said, I was somebody, and the room answered with dust. Margaret folded an old photo album and placed it in a drawer, her hands trembling only when unseen. Riley left a message that said, "You were still you," but it felt like a postcard from another lifetime. Damon's latest post spun on a nearby screen, cruelly efficient. Ava's words braided with strangers until they became scripture. Ethan sat on the floor and touched a guitar that had not been tuned in months, whispering songs into air too heavy to carry them. He tried to measure the gap between who he was and who they said he was. Margaret passed the doorway, eyes fixed straight ahead, and her silence was a verdict louder than thunder. Ethan said, "Do you remember?" But she closed the kitchen door behind her, and the latch sounded final. Ethan wandered through memory like a museum after closing, where laughter echoed from rooms now locked. He touched a framed newspaper clipping celebrating his first break and said, "That was me," but the words felt like fiction. Margaret set breakfast on the table, but left the chair empty, her footsteps fading like an answer withheld. Riley wrote another text, longer this time, but Ethan did not read it. He feared her hope would drown in his despair. Damon's thread was dissected on morning shows, each line weighed like law. Ava's face appeared in a new interview, smile polished and rehearsed. Ethan pressed his palms to the window glass, fogging the pain, staring at a street that looked smaller than yesterday. He said, "They don't know me." But the whisper died in the hum of passing cars. The coffee cooled. The toast hardened. Margaret wiped the counter until it gleamed, her back to him, and silence layered itself like paint. In the living room, the air felt too heavy for sound. Ethan held a family photo in his hands, tracing faces that once promised safety. He said, "You believed in me then," though no one answered. Margaret stood by the bookshelf, pretending to rearrange titles, but her eyes never landed on him. Riley's voicemail echoed faintly through the speaker, her voice frayed with fear. Damon's followers multiplied, their comments sharpening like knives. Ava leaned into the camera with the confidence of someone ascending on another's fall. Ethan rubbed his temples and said, "I could explain everything," but he knew explanation had lost its value. The couch sagged under the weight of his body in silence, while Margaret kept her back straight, spine like steel, choosing not to break the quiet. A clock ticked, merciless in its honesty, and Ethan realized the gulf between them was wider than the mob outside. The house still carried echoes of better days, the kind that smelled of cinnamon and laughter. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Do you remember the fair?" Margaret paused, her hand hovering over the sink, then lowered it slowly. Riley's texts went unanswered, each one a lighthouse dimming with distance. Damon announced another update, his tone triumphant. Ava's branded smile flashed across the news ticker like a crown. Ethan pressed his forehead to the wall, eyes closed, and thought of cotton candy on his tongue, fireworks in his chest. He whispered, "I am not what they say," but the words fell like sparks into water. Margaret dried her hands on a towel, turned away, and walked into another room, leaving behind the sound of her footsteps, steady and retreating. The house grew colder, and Ethan wondered if silence was a punishment worse than rage. The night returned with its chorus of screams and whispers. Ethan sat on the floor, knees to chest, the glow of his phone painting him in cold light. He scrolled through old photos of concerts, smiles, crowds that once believed. He said, "That was me," but it felt like a ghost speaking. Margaret's shadow stretched across the hall, motionless, a silent witness. Riley called again, her voice shaking as she pleaded, "Don't disappear." Damon dropped a new video, confident and cruel. Ava teased more revelations, her followers applauding. Ethan closed his eyes and imagined applause not born of blood. He whispered, "I want to be heard," but his voice vanished beneath the digital roar. Margaret leaned against the wall, eyes closed, hands clenched at her sides, her silence cutting deeper than any word. The night pressed close, and Ethan's breathing sounded like survival measured second by second. By morning, Ethan's inbox was a graveyard of broken promises and cancellations, each subject line ablaze. He said, "You knew me," but the screen gave back nothing but empty headers. Riley whispered through a voicemail, "They'll regret this," though her words cracked with doubt. Damon celebrated the exits like trophies, narrating with a grin. Ava slid links to replacements with the sweetness of poisoned fruit. Margaret poured tea and set it down in front of Ethan without speaking, her silence loud enough to drown a city. Ethan touched the rim of the mug, but never lifted it, watching steam curl like fading smoke. He said, "I don't know if I can survive this," and no one in the room corrected him. Outside, rain drummed steady, as though time was marking his undoing in drops against glass. Friends who once laughed with Ethan now replied with silence, their avatars glowing online, but their messages absent. He scrolled names, whispering, "Where are you?" And his voice trembled with anger that masked grief. Riley sent a picture of them from last year, writing, "This is still us," but Ethan's hands shook too hard to reply. Damon posted charts that turned Ethan's fall into entertainment, as if numbers could map a collapse. Ava shared motivational quotes above his name like salt rubbed into wounds. Margaret sat in her chair, knitting without purpose, her needles clicking like a clock marking endings. Ethan said, "Everyone's gone," and the room, heavy with static, seemed to agree. The world narrowed until it felt smaller than the phone in his hand. The notifications grew crueler by the hour. Threats dressed as jokes, jokes sharpened into blades. Ethan muttered, "They don't know me." But his voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. Riley called again, and her voicemail begged, "Please answer me," softer each time. Damon mocked the silence, calling it confession. Ava painted herself as victim of association, her smile smooth as glass. Margaret stood at the window, staring out with her arms folded, body stiff as stone. Ethan slammed his phone onto the table, shattering the case, but the screen glowed still, relentless. He pressed his palms to his face, whispering, "Make it stop." The rain had ended, but the storm inside him only grew louder. Family fractures widened as whispers spread inside the house. Ethan overheard Margaret's phone call with a cousin, her words careful but sharp, "It's too much to carry." He clenched his jaw, whispering, "You don't believe me." Riley texted, "You're not alone," but Ethan felt lonelier than ever. Damon framed Margaret's silence as proof, turning absence into evidence. Ava reposted family photos with captions twisting love into shame. Ethan slammed the cupboard shut, the sound cracking through the kitchen like thunder. Margaret looked at him with eyes that flinched but said nothing. He said, "I needed you," and her quiet reply was averted eyes that burned like fire. The fracture inside the walls deepened, until even the silence echoed. Margaret's silence became Ethan's sharpest wound. She sat at the edge of the couch, hands folded, eyes cast down, and he whispered, "Why won't you speak for me?" But the words met a wall. Riley's voice note played in the background like an echo, "I believe you," trembling but small. Damon went live, declaring victory in silence. Ava tightened the noose with polished interviews, her tone full of false sympathy. Ethan stood in the doorway, shoulders slumped, every breath weighted like stone. He said, "Your silence is louder than their words," and Margaret closed her eyes, pressing her lips until they turned white. The house felt colder than the street outside, and Ethan realized the betrayal inside his home hurt more than the mob beyond the walls. The mob discovered buried fragments of Ethan's past, screenshots twisted into daggers, and strangers screamed louder than truth. Ethan muttered, "That was years ago," but the words dissolved in the storm. Riley begged in a message, "Don't let them rewrite you," yet her voice drowned in trending tags. Damon sharpened his voice on live streams, calling it a reckoning, while Ava reposted with captions framed as moral clarity. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, flipping through bills like armor, her silence steady, deliberate. Ethan pressed his palms against the wall, heartbeat hammering like fists. The house felt smaller than ever, walls closing with every refresh. He said, "It will never end," and no answer came. The silence inside matched the noise outside, both merciless. Behind closed doors, Damon leaned back in his chair, savoring his rise. He told his camera, "Justice delivers rewards. voice laced with triumph. Ethan's name fed his following, each post like oil on fire. Ava scrolled gleefully, framing herself as advocate, but her grin betrayed hunger. Ethan sat in the dark, muttering, "They're making a career out of my ashes." Riley texted again, "Fight back," her courage trembling but real. Margaret kept her gaze on folded laundry, never lifting her eyes. Ethan whispered, "You're enjoying this," to shadows no one else could see. The betrayal outside was clear, but the betrayal inside grew heavier, silence suffocating where words should have defended him. Colleagues who once shook Ethan's hand now released public statements denouncing him, their words polished for headlines. Ethan read one aloud, voice cracking, "We cannot condone," before tossing the paper aside. Riley messaged, "They're cowards," but Ethan's fingers froze, unable to reply. Damon amplified their words like gospel, while Ava stitched them into her narrative of virtue. Margaret sat nearby, silent, her knitting needles clacking as if rhythm could drown the weight. Ethan's eyes burned, whispering, "You said I was family." The air inside thickened until even breathing felt like betrayal. Each word released online was another stone piled onto his chest, another rope around his throat. Then a rumor surfaced, slick as oil, claiming new sins Ethan never committed. He slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "That's a lie," but his words evaporated into silence. Riley said through voicemail, "I know it's false," but her voice carried fear. Damon smirked on camera, hinting he had sources. Ava framed the rumor as tragic truth, her tone dipped in sorrow. Margaret sat at the sink, hands in water, staring out the window, her silence colder than the rain outside. Ethan's phone buzzed with strangers writing curses in bold. He leaned forward, face in hands, whispering, "What else will they invent?" The rumor spread faster than his heartbeat, unstoppable, merciless. At night, Ethan collapsed onto the couch, shoulders heavy with exhaustion, heavier than sleep. He whispered, "I can't carry this," voice raw. Riley's final text buzzed unseen, "I'll stand with you, no matter what." Damon delivered another smirk to his swelling audience. Ava bathed in praise that belonged to someone else's pain. Margaret sat on the other end of the couch, staring forward, her silence like a wall built brick by brick. Ethan said, "Say something," but she folded her arms tight, refusing to meet his eyes. The house hummed with refrigerator noise and distant traffic, but inside was a vacuum, absence roaring louder than chaos. Ethan pressed his palms over his ears, but silence still screamed. The world shifted when a forgotten voice reappeared, a coworker from Ethan's past who whispered truth in a small podcast no one expected. Ethan listened, trembling as the words cut through lies like light through fog. The voice said, "I saw everything, and it wasn't him." Riley shouted into a message, "This is what we needed." Damon hesitated briefly in his stream, a crack in his armor, while Ava scrolled nervously, rehearsing new lines. Margaret paused in the hallway, frozen, her hand pressed to the wall as though holding back an avalanche. Ethan whispered, "Finally," and tears slid down his face, fragile as glass. The mob faltered for the first time, but not enough to stop the noise. Yet in that moment, Ethan felt a spark, a reminder that truth still had weight. A file appeared online, fragments of evidence pieced together, and Ethan's heart pounded with both hope and fear. He said, "They'll see now," though his voice cracked as if testing belief. Riley wrote, "This changes everything," sending screenshot after screenshot. Damon deflected on camera, insisting context was complicated, his grin brittle. Ava posted vague apologies masked as wisdom, her followers applauding her courage for pretending she never doubted. Margaret sat in the corner, clutching her mug as though warmth could replace words. Ethan stared at the evidence, breath quick, whispering, "It's not enough, is it?" The internet buzzed with division, some defending, some attacking harder. The storm hadn't cleared, but a fracture had split through its roar. Riley stepped forward, her voice breaking into the noise as she posted her defense of Ethan with fierce clarity. She wrote, I know him, and this is wrong. Knowing the risk to herself, Ethan whispered, "You didn't have to," his voice heavy with gratitude and fear. Damon mocked her loyalty, sneering into his camera, while Ava dismissed her words as emotional bias. Margaret watched Riley's video on her phone, lips pressed, her silence still louder than any defense. Ethan leaned against the table, breath shallow, whispering, "She's braver than all of you." The defenders were few, but their voices pierced the mob like arrows against a storm. For the first time, Ethan felt less alone, though the cost weighed heavy. The betrayal revealed itself when Ethan uncovered messages from Damon, proof of manipulation masked as virtue. Ethan shouted, "It was you," his voice ragged, shaking the quiet house. Riley texted in all caps, "Expose him," her faith sharp as steel. Ava deleted old posts, rewriting history with careful precision, pretending she never joined the fire. Margaret held the phone in her lap, scrolling slowly, her breath unsteady, eyes unreadable. Ethan pressed the evidence to the table, whispering, "You built this storm." The weight of betrayal crushed him, not from strangers, but from someone who once shook his hand. The truth burned hot, yet the mob had not yet decided to see. The audience online hesitated, divided between fury and doubt, their certainty cracking. Ethan scrolled, trembling, whispering, "Do you see me now?" His words pleaded, fragile as glass. Riley's message pinged, "Keep going, don't stop." Damon sat in his studio, grin slipping, the mask of authority thinning. Ava spun her new angle, claiming she wanted truth all along. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching Ethan with eyes that flickered between shame and sorrow. Ethan said, "I was never who they said I was," his voice strong for the first time in weeks. The truth had surfaced, but redemption was still fragile, a spark struggling against the storm. Ethan stormed into the studio where Damon recorded, fury pounding in his veins like war drums. He shouted, "You built this lie," and his voice cracked the room like glass shattering. Damon smirked, feigning calm, but his eyes flickered with unease. Riley's message vibrated on Ethan's phone, "Do it, tell them," unseen but pulsing. Ava tuned in from afar, already typing her next pivot. Margaret stood in the doorway, pale, trembling, her silence heavy as stone. Ethan slammed the desk, the sound echoing like thunder, demanding, "Why me?" Damon shrugged, voice cold, "Because it was easy." Rage met silence, and the walls themselves seemed to close in. Ethan's voice shook with raw defiance as he declared, "I am not the monster you made me." Damon laughed nervously, adjusting his tie, but the mask slipped. Riley posted Ethan's confrontation live, her caption burning, "Truth in real time." Ava scrambled to redirect, her tone desperate for control. Margaret whispered, barely audible, "Stop," but Ethan pressed forward, his words fueled by months of silence and pain. The studio lights hummed, cameras rolling, catching every fracture in Damon's false authority. Ethan leaned closer, face inches from the lens, shouting, "Look at me, look at the man you destroyed." The internet roared, divided, but for the first time, Ethan spoke louder than the storm. Margaret's silence thundered when Ethan turned toward her, voice trembling, "You never defended me." She froze, hands twisting in her cardigan, unable to speak. Riley's live stream comment scrolled across screens. "Even family won't stand." Damon smirked faintly, sensing her silence as victory. Ava seized it instantly, posting, "Even his mother says nothing." Ethan's chest heaved, his words breaking, "Your silence is my sentence." Margaret looked away, eyes glistening, her lips trembling but sealed shut. The air thickened, crushing Ethan as he realized the betrayal closest to home, cut deeper than Damon's lies. His fists unclenched, but the wound within widened beyond repair. The confrontation cracked wide open when Ethan's voice collapsed into a scream, "You don't get to erase me." Damon shouted back, "The world already did." Sparks of rage collided like lightning in the room. Riley's feed trembled as thousands tuned in, some cheering, others mocking. Ava typed frantically, shaping narratives before the dust even settled. Margaret covered her ears, tears sliding as her silence strangled her from within. Ethan's scream broke into sobs, his body shaking with months of buried torment. Damon leaned back smugly, whispering, "You'll never recover." The studio buzzed with electric fury, the climax spilling over like a storm with no end. The storm reached its violent peak when Ethan collapsed to his knees, sobbing. "I can't carry this anymore." Riley's voice streamed through his phone, crying, "You're not alone," her faith steady even in chaos. Damon sneered, but his voice cracked with the pressure of exposure. Ava deleted her posts, silence betraying fear of backlash. Margaret stood trembling, her hand half raised toward Ethan, but she froze, unable to close the distance. Ethan lifted his tear-streaked face to the camera, whispering, "This is what they took." The silence after his words was heavier than thunder. The climax left no one untouched, the internet buzzing like a broken hive, torn between sympathy and scorn. Morning arrived like a held breath released, and the studio's echo faded to a dull ache. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, counting the quiet between drips in the sink. He said, "It didn't fix everything," and the room agreed with tired light. Riley texted, "You stood up," and the words warmed like a hand on his shoulder. Damon posted nothing, and silence from him felt like a crack in a statue. Ava archived her pivots and called it growth, polishing her reflection in a dark screen. Margaret moved through the house like a careful tide, setting a plate, removing it, then setting it again. Ethan whispered, "I'm still here," and the truth of it steadied his breath. Outside, the street hummed with ordinary life that had once felt unreachable. The internet argued with itself like weather over two cities, one sunny, one flooded. Ethan scrolled slowly and said, "They don't agree, and maybe they never will." Riley replied, "You don't need everyone." A few sponsors wrote cautious emails shaped like apologies stapled to disclaimers. Damon's grin returned in a smaller frame, brittle around the edges. Ava delivered a thread about nuance that praised her own reflection. Margaret paused in the doorway, hands clasped, then looked at Ethan without speaking. He felt the weight shift, not gone, but move to a place he could carry. He said, "I will rebuild at human speed," and the vow fit his chest like honest armor. Ethan stepped outside and found the air unremarkable, which felt miraculous. He walked past neighbors who pretended not to stare and said, "Good morning," like a bridge laid plank by plank. A boy on a scooter passed and didn't care about headlines, which eased something tight in his ribs. Riley called and said, "Keep walking," and he did, matching breath to footsteps. Damon's newest video trailed behind him like distant thunder, ignorable at last. Ava's timeline glowed with brand-safe wisdom, but her rhythm felt out of season. Ethan paused at a crosswalk and whispered, "I am not a trend." The light changed, and the world moved with him instead of over him. Riley stood in front of her small camera and said, "Loyalty costs something, and I paid gladly." Her voice steadied with each word, turning doubt into a map. Onto a map. Ethan listened, grateful, and whispered, "You saved the thread that kept me human." Damon tried to reclaim the narrative with a new guest, but the applause sounded canned. Ava promised a panel on accountability, already selling ad space between remorse and perfume. Margaret watched Riley's video to the end and did not look away. The house felt different, like a door had opened somewhere unseen. Ethan said, "Thank you," and the words found a place to live. Dusk folded into the house like a quiet verdict. Ethan stood in the doorway to the living room, and Margaret sat on the couch with hands folded. He said, "I needed you," and the words didn't accuse. They ached. She looked up, mouth opening, then closing, and her throat worked around a sentence that never arrived. Riley's message chimed, only 3 words, a lighthouse in a pocket. Ethan exhaled and said, "I'll go on without the word I wanted." The room held its breath. Outside, a siren passed and didn't stop. Ethan turned toward the hallway, and his final whisper cut clean as glass, "Your silence taught me how to speak."